Now, you guys, this is why you have to always be careful when you're going out of town for spring break. Now, authorities say that these two men met a 24-year-old woman at a restaurant Thursday in Miami Beach. They then went back to her hotel room, gave her a pill that made her unconscious, and then they assaulted and killed her. You guys, after killing her, they then robbed her, took her cell phone, and took a lot of her belongings. 9 times out of 10, this girl was just down here trying to have a good time, and she ran into 2 evil people.
Woman charged with drugging, robbing, and raping a woman on South Beach. Investigators say the 24-year-old victim from Pennsylvania was found partly nude and lifeless inside her room at the Albion Hotel on James Avenue Thursday.
Couldn't even pick up a phone to call the police or 911 after they did whatever they did to her.
Now, it's being said they used her credit cards to basically pay for their spring break trip. Both men have been charged and they have no bond.
Hi, I'm Cam, and this carnival worker went on a killing spree. In March of 2019, Cynthia and her daughter, 17-year-old Jocelyn Alsop, went to their local Georgia State Fair. There they met 23-year-old James Wright, a carnival worker. James offered Jocelyn a free horse ride. After the fair, Cynthia discovered disturbing messages from James to her daughter where he said he wanted to marry her. Jocelyn was a frequent weekend runaway according to her mom, but when she hadn't heard from her, she knew something was wrong. Cynthia learned about her daughter's murder from a press conference on May 13, 2019. Cynthia also learned that James had killed 3 women total during an 18-day period. February 28th, James shot and killed 22-year-old Elizabeth Van Meter after they got into an argument. On March 9th, the day after Cynthia reported her daughter missing, James had sex with Jocelyn, shot her, and covered her body with logs in the woods by his home. March 17th, James said he, quote, tripped and shot 25-year-old Athena Hobson in the head, killing her. He apparently loaded her body into the truck and was en route to the hospital when she, quote, fell out. James said he got scared and dumped her body into a river. Police have located the murder weapon and 2 of the victims' bodies. Athena has yet to be found. Cynthia believes her daughter Jocelyn was tricked into leaving Georgia to go to Virginia with James, or he kidnapped her. Cynthia believes he needs the death penalty.
Imagine you break into your ex-lover's house and brutally murder his new wife in a fit of jealous rage. You also happen to be a young police officer at the time, and you stage the crime scene to look like a robbery, and that's just what police deem it at the time. And over the next 23 years, you work your way up the police department and become a detective that specializes in stolen art cases, which apparently the issue of stolen art rampant enough to require its own special unit. Now, over the span of time that you got on with your life and swept that murder under the rug, DNA testing got real good, and your Van Gogh sniffing ass is about to have that nice cushy lifestyle turned right the upside down. In 2009, police just decided, hey, let's test the bite mark left on Sherry Rasmussen's arm. The DNA came back as female. They were like, female burglars? That's not a thing. They decided to pursue the theory that the Rasmussens had suspected the whole time that Stephanie Lazarus was the killer. So the cops just went into the office, pulled a discarded cup out of the garbage that Stephanie was drinking. When they swabbed it, it was a perfect match. Stephanie's own colleagues brought her in for questioning, and that's where shit gets spicy. 23 years after Stephanie Lazarus murdered Sherry Rasmussen, the wife of a man that Stephanie used to date, she's brought in for questioning. Sherry and her husband John's families had long suspected that Stephanie was the killer, even though cops suspected it was a robbery. They had even told police that Stephanie would stalk John and Sherry and go by their house and even Sherry's place of work, telling Sherry that if she couldn't have John, then no one could. Police now had the DNA evidence to prove that Stephanie was the person who broke in, smashed a vase over Sherry's head, brutally beat her in the face with the butt of her gun, left a bite mark on her arm, and shot her 3 times. Police just went up to Stephanie in the office one day and were just like, hey, this'll just take a second. We just want to talk to you about a stolen art case. They weren't there to talk about no art. They were like, hey, did you know somebody named John Rutten? What went down next is one of the most enjoyable dismantlings of someone's aura of invincibility that you could ever hope to see. And as they suck her back into that time period, the screws that held Stephanie's face in a normal-looking position for 23 years start to loosen. Best part is they tell her she's free to go, and she goes out into the hallway, and they handcuff her and arrest her right there.
You have the right to remain silent. Do you understand?
Yes.
We all know what happened at Columbine High School on April 20th, 1999. But what a lot of people may not know is what happened to 2 Columbine survivors less than a year later. On the night of February 13th, 2000, Stephanie Hart Grizel got into her pajamas and told her mother goodnight, and that she was just going to finish some homework and studying for school. Stephanie instead went to visit her boyfriend, Nick Kunzelman, at the subway where he worked less than a mile away from Columbine High School. He was working the night shift that night and was entrusted to close up the shop by himself. Stephanie was 16 years old and a sophomore at Columbine, and Nicholas Kunzelman was 15 years old and a sophomore at Columbine. They had both survived the tragedy less than a year before. Part 2 coming up.
Tokyo wanted to honor the oldest man in the city. What they found in his apartment will give you
In
chills.
2010, Tokyo officials wanted to congratulate Sojin Kato for becoming the oldest man in their city. They went to his apartment on his 111th birthday to pay their respects. What they found in the apartment instead was his mummified remains. The remains were thought to be over 30 years old. It's thought that he died at the age of 79. It turns out his family had failed to report him as dead. Instead, they'd been living off his pension checks. For more 7 Sins Crime, remember to hit the plus button.
Hi, I'm Cam, and this Jeffrey Dahmer obsessed fan took it way too far. On June 20th, 2020, 19-year-old Chance Seneca met up with 18-year-old Holden White after they had been talking through Grindr for over a month. When the two finally met, Holden said it scarred him for life. Holden said everything was fine until Chance left the room, returned, and started choking him with a cord. Holden was choked by Chance until every blood vessel in his face ruptured. He lost his vision and then his consciousness. And I want to give a warning because this is about to get very graphic. Holden woke up in Chance's bathtub to him slicing open his left wrist. He was naked, soaked in his own blood, and on the verge of death. He repeated to himself, "Stay calm," thinking it was the end. Holden was in a coma for 3 days. On that third day, he saw a light and he went towards it. He woke up with a breathing tube down his throat, wrapped in bandages all over. Holden had suffered 6 stab wounds to the neck, blunt force trauma to his head, and deep cuts in his wrist. Chance had called the police thinking he had murdered Holden. What's even more disturbing is Chance has tried to kidnap and dismember 2 other gay men. He planned on using their bodies as trophies and food. Hi, I'm Cam, and this is the Oklahoma City Massacre. On April 19, 1995, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols committed the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in U.S. history. At 9 a.m. that day, Timothy drove up to the Alfred P. Murray Federal Building carrying deadly explosives. He lit a 5-minute fuse and a 2-minute fuse and parked the truck in a drop-off zone under a kids' daycare center. He got out, locked the truck, and dropped the keys blocks away. At 9:02 a.m., the bomb detonated. 646 people were inside the building. 168 people were killed. 680 more were injured. The victims were from 3 months old to 73 years old. 19 victims were children, and 3 of the victims were pregnant women. The last rescued survivor was a 15-year-old girl found under the base of the building. The blast destroyed 324 surrounding buildings, and it could be heard and felt from 55 miles away. The bomb was equivalent to 5,000 pounds of TNT. Timothy was executed by lethal injection on June 11, 2001. Terry Nichols is serving 161 consecutive life terms in a maximum security prison, and he's still alive today.
Jennifer Servo was murdered in her apartment in the early hours of September 16, 2002, in Abilene, Texas. Her killer has still not been caught. Jennifer was a 22-year-old news anchor who had recently moved from Montana to Abilene, Texas to start her new job at KRBC after graduating from college. On September 15, 2002, Jennifer finished up a long shift at KRBC and left work around 10 p.m. She was then seen on surveillance footage at a grocery store at 10:45 p.m. with her friend and coworker, Brian Travers. Jennifer was supposed to have a few days off from work, but on September 17, 2002, her boss called her to ask if she could come in and help them out, but he didn't get a response when he called. He tried again on the 18th and still couldn't get a response from Jennifer. Brian Travers and another coworker drove by Jennifer's apartment to check on her and noted that her blinds were down, which was odd because she usually left them up for her cat to see outside. Part 2 coming up. That day, September 18, 2002, Jennifer's boss called her apartment complex to do a welfare check on her. Soon after this, Jennifer's coworkers at KRBC heard on the police scanner that there was police activity at Jennifer's apartment and a possible DOA. It was confirmed on September 18, 2002 that Jennifer Servo had been found deceased in her apartment. Jennifer had been sexually assaulted and strangled, and there was blunt force trauma to her head. Numerous bloodstains were found throughout the apartment, and her phone and her purse were missing from the scene. They have still not been located to this day. No murder weapon has ever been found either. There was also no sign of forced entry into the home. Her phone records were examined, and it was discovered that around 12:30 a.m. on September 16, 2002, Jennifer had a conversation on the phone with an ex-boyfriend named Dave Warren. Dave was a previous longtime boyfriend of Jennifer's, but police quickly ruled him out because he had been over 1,000 miles away back in Montana at the time of Jennifer's murder. Part 3 coming up. Now, of course, because Brian Travers was the last person confirmed to see Jennifer alive, he was investigated. Brian said that after grocery shopping together, she helped him unload groceries at his house and then went home herself. 1 week after Jennifer's murder, Brian discloses to police that Jennifer had confided in him that she thought she was being followed. In fact, Brian said that Jennifer thought they were being followed that night as they were headed home from the grocery store. There was allegedly some form of intimacy shared between Brian and Jennifer, but according to Jennifer's friends, it had been a one-time thing for her and she was not interested in anything romantic with Brian. It's alleged that Brian did want more than a friendship with Jennifer, but he has never confirmed this himself. Forensic examination of the apartment revealed multiple DNA profiles from different males around the apartment. One of those profiles did belong to Brian Travers, but he was friends with Jennifer and had admitted that he had been in her apartment before many times. Part 4 coming up. One of those DNA profiles, however, did belong to a more recent ex of Jennifer's, a man named Ralph Sepulveda. Jennifer and Ralph met in the Army Reserves and began a relationship, and Ralph actually moved with Jennifer from Montana to Abilene when she started her new job at KRBC. However, a few weeks after they get to Abilene, Jennifer finds out from Ralph that he not only had a fiancé back in Montana, but he also had a child. She immediately broke things off, but Ralph didn't move back to Montana. He moved not far away from Jennifer's apartment. Friends of Jennifer's have stated that Jennifer told them that Ralph apparently had some sexual preferences that made her uncomfortable, namely choking. Ralph eventually refuses to take a polygraph test, and eventually he goes to San Antonio, Texas, about 4 hours away from Abilene. He has never been charged or arrested in connection with Jennifer's murder. Part 5 coming up. In January of 2003, 4 months after Jennifer's murder, her family receives a letter from the University of Montana, where she graduated, stating that someone had used her library card to check out 4 books after her murder. Her library card could very well have been inside of her purse, which again, was never located. And that is all the information we have about the murder of Jennifer Servo. To this day, no suspects have ever been arrested in connection with her death. If you have any information about the murder of Jennifer Servo on September 16, 2002 in Abilene, Texas, please contact the Abilene Crime Stoppers at 325-676-8477.